Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. This is Boring History for Sleep, where we drift back through time. Two lives that were ordinary, difficult, and quietly fascinating. Together we will wander into the Bronze Age, a time before great empires, before the written word was widespread, when most of the world was not made of marble palaces or bustling cities, but of open skies, rough pastures, and people doing their best simply to endure another day. Tonight, we will explore what it was like to live as a shepherd in the Mycenaean lands of Greece. A life filled with silence and hardship, with long hours, and with very little glory. We'll move through the collapse of that world, a mysterious unraveling of civilizations. Then, we'll pause to examine the puzzles left behind in the form of Linear B, a script of lists and records that was nearly forgotten. And finally, we'll step inside the great palace at Narcissus, where power, ritual, and beauty stood in contrast to the shepherd's humble life. As always, let the pace of the words wash over you gently. Allow your body to rest, while your mind drifts with the rhythm of history. You may close your eyes, or simply let them grow heavy. If you fall asleep, that is perfectly fine. That, in fact, is the purpose. So let us begin. In the windswept hills of Bronze Age Greece, with the life of a shepherd, why it sucks to be a shepherd in Mycenaean Greece. Imagine yourself standing on a rough hillside, the air tinged with the sharp, dry scent of thyme and sage growing among the rocks. The land is not lush, not generous. The soil here is thin, the ground uneven. You are a shepherd, tending your flock of sheep and goats. They wander slowly, noses to the earth, searching for sparse blades of grass and stubborn shrubs that cling to life among the stones. Your life begins early, long before the sun has risen high. The sheep stir, bleating softly, demanding to be led to pasture. You rise from a bed that is little more than a mat of reeds or wool. The air is chill. Bronze Age Greece did not have the comforts of central heating or thick walls. At night, the cold settled into your bones. The warmth of the day will come later, but for now, the world is gray and hushed. The shepherd's work is relentless. There's no day off, no break from the cycle. Sheep must eat every day, rain or shine, in sickness or health. They are vulnerable creatures, easy prey for wolves, jackals, or even human raiders. You, the shepherd, must stay near them, watching always, carrying a staff or perhaps a sling with stones to ward off danger. The fear of wolves was real. At night, you would hear them in the distance, their calls echoing across the hills. Sometimes you've built small enclosures of wood and stone, thorn branches woven into fences to keep the flock in place. But a determined wolf could leap or burrow, and so you slept lightly, always listening, knowing that a single attack could mean the loss of animals you could not afford to lose. Food for yourself was simple and repetitive. Barley bread, coarse and heavy, maybe a bit of goat cheese if you were fortunate. Olives when they were in season, meat was rare. You did not slaughter sheep for your own meals, not unless one was old, lame, or dying. Animals were wealth, and wealth had to be guarded. You lived always on the edge of hunger, not starving perhaps, but never truly satisfied. Your clothes were practical but rough. Wool spun from your own animals, not finely woven, but heavy and scratchy. And always, it smelled faintly of wet lanolin, for the sheep were not just your charges, they were your constant companions. Rain made everything worse. When storms rolled in from the sea, the air turned damp and heavy. Your cloak grew sodden, your feet slipped in the mud. Wet wool clung to you, and to the animals, with a musty, sour smell that lingered for days. Life was governed not by clocks, but by natural rhythms. The rising and setting of the sun, the need to move the flock from summer pastures to winter ones, the growth of grass after rains. You lived close to the land, but the land did not care for you in return. It gave grudgingly, and only with constant effort. There was little comfort in religion for a humble shepherd. The gods of the Mycenaeans were unpredictable, distant. You might leave a small offering grain, a bit of oil, or wool to appease the spirit of the hills. You might whisper a prayer for safe weather, for protection from lightning or sudden storms. But often, it seemed the gods did not hear. Storms destroyed pastures, disease carried off animals. The gods, it seemed, favored the palaces and the kings, not the shepherds who toiled in obscurity. Loneliness was a constant. You spent long hours alone, watching sheep graze, listening only to their bleating, the crunch of hooves on stone, the sigh of the wind. Sometimes you might sing to pass the hours, a low chant, repeating words you barely thought about. Sometimes you carved a piece of wood, or tied knots in cord, anything to keep your hands busy. And yet, there was a rhythm to it, a strange comfort in repetition. The flock moved slowly across the hillside. The seasons turned predictable in their cycle. Your life was hard, but it was steady. You knew what to expect. A shepherd's life was exhausting, but it was also eternal, stretching back to ancestors and forward to descendants. And so you endured. Day after day, year after year, with wet wool, with wolves in the night, with the endless sound of sheep. The collapse of the Bronze Age, the world of the shepherd, the farmer, and even the king, was bound together by invisible threads. Ships carried copper from Cyprus, tin from faraway lands, grain, oil, wine, and finely worked goods from palace to palace, port to port. For centuries, these connections seemed strong, like a woven net stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. But around the 12th century before our era, those threads began to fray, and soon after, they snapped entirely. Archaeologists today call it the Bronze Age collapse, a time when nearly every great palace system from Greece to Anatolia, from the Levant to Egypt, suffered destruction or abandonment. Imagine a scribe, his wax tablet still warm in his hand, suddenly without an office, his palace burned. Imagine a shepherd who once drove his flock to the palace storehouses for trade, now finding the storehouses silent, the courtyards blackened with soot. The reasons for this collapse remain the subject of endless study and debate. Some say it was the arrival of foreign raiders, the so-called sea peoples, who swept across the coasts like a storm. Others point to earthquakes, a chain of tremors that toppled walls and temples. Still others speak of drought, a long, unrelenting dryness that turned fields brittle and empty, sending whole peoples on the move in search of sustenance. Most likely, it was all of these forces together. A fragile system, interdependent and finely tuned, was simply unable to withstand so many shocks at once. If you walk among the ruins today, at places like Mycenae, Ugarit, or Hattusa, you will see blackened stone, fallen blocks left untouched for millennia. You might even find tablets, baked hard by the fires that consumed the buildings, recording shipments of grain, weapons allocations, or religious offerings. The very last words written before silence descended. For ordinary people, this collapse was not an abstract shift in politics or trade. It was a sudden emptiness. Markets gone, protection vanished. Gods who once seemed secure, now silent in their shrines. A shepherd, once fearful of wolves, might now have feared hunger more. Communities grew smaller, villages more self-reliant, and the wide world of bronze-forged connections shrunk to the narrow horizon of survival. And yet, as always, life continued. Sheep still needed tending, fields still yielded what they could, songs were still sung around hearth fires, but the grandeur of palaces and trade routes was gone. A great silence settling across the lands where once kings boasted of their power. The mystery of Linear B, when the palaces of the Mycenaean world collapsed in fire and ruin, it seemed that almost everything had been lost. The frescoes crumbled, the golden treasures were looted, and the songs that once echoed in great halls faded into silence. But amid the destruction, something unexpected survived. Hundreds of small clay tablets, hardened not by design but by accident, baked solid in the very flames that destroyed the buildings around them. On these tablets, pressed with a reed stylus, were neat rows of strange marks. Straight lines, small triangles, curious strokes, arranged in patterns, like the quiet footprints of a forgotten mind. They were not pictures like Egyptian hieroglyphs, nor were they letters in the way we think of writing today. This was something different, something older. A script scholars came to call Linear B for decades. These tablets were studied and admired, yet they remained mute. No one could say what language they recorded, or even if they marked the speech of the Greeks or of some vanished people. Some thought they might be trade codes, others imagined they were sacred hymns or lists of kings. The marks were orderly, deliberate, but the meaning lay sealed, like a voice behind a wall. Generation after generation of scholars tried to decipher them. Charts were drawn, theories proposed, connections made to every known script from across the Mediterranean. But the symbols resisted. Each guess dissolved into uncertainty, and Linear B came to seem like one of history's cruel riddles, a key broken in its lock. And then, almost by accident, the mystery began to shift. In the 1940s and 50s, an English architect named Michael Ventris, a man not trained as a historian but gifted with languages and a mind for patterns, took up the challenge. By day he worked on designing buildings, but by night, in quiet rooms, filled with notebooks and index cards, he pored over the tablets. He was not content with broad theories. He wanted the signs to speak, letter by letter, sound by sound. Slowly, he noticed patterns. Certain groups of symbols repeated at the start of lines. Others appeared only where numbers were written. He began to suspect that this was not an unknown language at all, but something older, familiar, a language we thought had no written form at such an early age. In 1952, the breakthrough came. Ventris realized that the signs recorded a form of Greek, not the Greek of Homer or Plato, but its earliest ancestor, spoken centuries before those names were even imagined. The tablets turned out to be records of grain, wine, bronze, wool, and oil, careful inventories kept by scribes to track the wealth of their palaces. It was not poetry or myth, but the practical heartbeat of an ancient economy, a voice from the Bronze Age at last made audible. The discovery was astonishing. For the first time, the Mycenaeans were not shadows or legends. They were Greeks, their language tied to the world that would later shape Western thought. Linear B gave us kings' names, lists of offerings to gods, and the echo of a bureaucratic machine that must have managed thousands of lives with precision and order. And yet, as much as the breakthrough revealed, it also reminded us of how much remains hidden. The tablets tell us what the scribes counted, but not what they dreamed. They show us the machinery of palaces, but not the laughter, the grief, the daily rhythm of ordinary men and women. And beyond Linear B lies another puzzle still unsolved: Linear A, the script of Minoan Crete, whose symbols remain silent despite a century of study. So the Bronze Age speaks to us in fragments. A handful of words on clay, a scattering of signs across time, a chorus half heard from the edge of memory. It is enough to remind us that voices once filled those palaces, but not enough to let us hear them fully. The mystery of Linear B, solved yet incomplete, stands as a symbol of the age itself, partly illuminated, partly lost, a story half written in fire and silence. Life among the survivors. When the palaces fell silent and the last embers cooled, the world of the Bronze Age did not vanish entirely. Its ruins still stood against the sky, blackened walls and tumbled stones, marking places where kings once ruled. But life itself did not stop. Families gathered in the shadow of broken citadels, fields were sown again, flocks were tended, and small fires lit the darkness of villages that no longer looked to a distant palace for command. For those who lived through it, the change must have been disorienting. Where once a central authority demanded tribute, now there was no scribe to record their grain, no overseer to weigh their harvest. The great storage rooms, once filled with amphorae of oil and wine, lay empty and silent, and so each household turned inward, depending on their own labor, their own hands, their own land. It was a humbler life, but perhaps also a freer one. Children who might once have been conscripted to carry loads for the palace, now learned to fish or farm beside their parents. Communities once tied to the schedules of officials and priests, now built their own rhythms, guided by seasons and survival. There was hardship. Yes, tools grew cruder without the palace workshops. Art lost the flourish of master artisans, and writing itself nearly disappeared. But the people endured. Archaeology shows us their small clay huts, their handmade pottery, less ornate, but practical. We see graves dug with care, simple offerings of beads or tools laid beside the dead. Even in collapse, humanity clung to ritual, to love, to the need to remember. And slowly, over centuries, out of these scattered and quiet lives, a new world began to take shape. Trade returned along the coasts. Stories of past heroes were told by firelight, their names carried forward in oral tradition, until one day they would be sung in the verses of Homer. The seeds of Greek culture, language, myth, memory, survived along darkness, waiting for the light to return. To the survivors, it was not an age of beginnings, but simply life, day after day, of tending animals, patching roofs, worrying over harvests, fearing raids from neighbors just as desperate. And yet, unknowingly, they were the bridge between the fallen world of bronze and the rising age of iron, between forgotten scripts and the poetry that would one day flourish. They carried forward enough for civilization to bloom again. The story of the Bronze Age ends not with finality, but with resilience, an echo of endurance that whispers through history, that even when the great halls collapse, when knowledge burns and kingdoms fade, human life continues, quietly, stubbornly, laying the foundations for what is yet to come. The Bronze Age began with brilliance, kings in their palaces, scribes at their tablets, ships heavy with copper and tin sailing across the blue Aegean. It was an age of builders, of warriors, of scribes who fixed memory in clay. But like so many eras of human history, it carried within itself the seeds of fragility. When the storms came, whether of sea peoples, famine, or fire, those shining palaces crumbled. The script of Linear B fell silent, its tablets hardened into unread stone. And for centuries no one could remember the words that once commanded armies and harvests. And yet, the fall was never absolute. Life remained. Humble villages endured in the shadow of ruins, their people carrying stories and traditions across the darkness of centuries. They survived without the palaces, without the scribes, without the wealth that had once defined their world. From those survivors came the faint embers that would later ignite into the Greece of Homer. The city-states, the philosophers, the world we now recognize as the root of Western civilization. The Bronze Age ended, but its memory lived on in broken pottery, in fragments of script, and in the echoes of epic poetry that still sing of heroes long gone. History reminds us that collapse is never the end. It is a turning, a transformation, a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but the human story continues. And within each collapse lies the quiet endurance that allows new worlds to emerge. So tonight, as you rest, remember the silence of those palaces, the forgotten words of Linear B, and the small fires of survivors who carried memory through the dark. Their world is gone, but its echoes remain soft, persistent, and eternal.